Frank Herbert's Dune is often read as political allegory, ecological prophecy, or science fiction epic. But beneath its surface lies something else, a fully developed metaphysical system built around inheritance, memory, time, and transformation. At the center of this system is a figure called the Kwisatz Haderach, a prophesied being bred to bridge past and future, male and female, matter and vision, a prophetic contraction of time and space. In doing so, he sets the stage for a story that doesn't just reference religious patterns but tests them. What if memory could be inherited? What if the future could be seen? What if all the ancient structures of prophecy, identity, and destiny were real, but given to the wrong kind of system? That's the thought experiment Dune offers. And that's where we begin. The term Kwisatz Haderach is a deliberate distortion of the Hebrew phrase Kefitzat Haderech, meaning shortening of the way, a miraculous contraction of time and space associated in Jewish mysticism with prophetic figures like Elijah or the Baal Shem Tov. In that tradition, such contractions are not metaphors. They refer to real events, tied to the transmission of ancestral knowledge, the inheritance of prophetic function, and a metaphysics in which time is non-linear and memory is cumulative across generations. Frank Herbert did not misappropriate this idea. He understood it and built Dune as a system that tests its logic. The novel is not just a story of messianic failure or political allegory. It is a thought experiment constructed from a coherent pattern Herbert identified within Scripture, that memory, real, ancestral, genetic memory, may be inherited, and that this inheritance shapes identity, vision, power, and destiny. Scripture contains this pattern, though veiled in mythic narrative, encoded in the language of blessing, generation, dream, and prophecy. Herbert took that pattern and made it explicit. He constructed a society, the Bene Gesserit, the Fremen, the Atreides, around the mechanisms of selective memory transmission and ancestral access. He introduced conscious breeding lines, ritual initiations, and visionary drugs, not as fantasy, but as narrative technologies designed to pressure test what happens when the pattern is pursued without its original ethical and theological ground. What resulted was a closed system, a world in which memory is hoarded, not shared. Vision paralyzes rather than empowers. Prophecy culminates in tyranny, and the fulfillment of the archetype arrives not in healing, but in horror. This is not a failure of Herbert's understanding. It is the point. Dune explores what happens when biblical structures are activated with exclusive premises. It plays out the consequences of that logic to its apocalyptic end, but the pattern remains sound. What Herbert mapped, however darkly, still reflects the biblical schema. When reoriented around covenantal premises, relational identity, and ethical participation, the same structures yield a different outcome. Instead of fragmentation, they produce coherence. Instead of fatalism, renewal. Instead of domination, shared stewardship of memory and time. This analysis is not about correcting Dune or moralizing over it. The failures in Herbert's world are not flaws in design. They are natural consequences of a world that sought power without relationship, access without responsibility, memory without integration. This leaves us with the essential insight. Herbert uncovered something real. Whether that something is biologically active or metaphysically actual is a question of faith. Whether the possible equals the real is left to the reader. But the pattern is there, and it works. The first mystery in Dune is memory, not imagination, not abstraction, but actual inherited memory. The Bene Gesserit don't speculate about the past, they access it. Through ritual, training, and genetic design, they recover the full living record of their maternal lineage. Memory is not a metaphor for wisdom or history. It is a literal, transmissible architecture embedded in the flesh. But it is partial. The Reverend Mothers cannot cross the genetic threshold into paternal memory, and so for generations they work to produce the one who can, a male with full access to both lines. The Kwisatz Haderach. Paul Atreides becomes that figure. But his arrival does not bring harmony. His access to the full span of ancestral experience does not integrate, it overloads. His consciousness expands beyond the personal, the temporal, and the survivable. He sees the shape of human destiny and loses the ability to intervene in it. What should have been fulfillment becomes fracture. Here, Herbert demonstrates what happens when the system of genetic memory is activated without balance, without covenant, without relational grounding. Paul inherits everything except the structure that would allow him to carry it. He becomes the archetype in form, but not in function. This model has a referent in Scripture. The biblical tradition encodes a vision of humanity not as isolated minds, but as composite memory structures, individuals bearing forward the image of God through genealogical continuity. This is not symbolic language. The phrase, "in the image of God," is paired with generational recurrence. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. Genesis 1:27. He created them male and female and blessed them, and when they were created, he called them man. Genesis 5:2. The image is not singular, it is relational. It is not encoded in a single genetic line, but expressed through the union of male and female, of parent and child, of one generation to the next. The archetype of Adam is not an individual to be achieved, but a pattern to be distributed across time. Humanity is not a vessel, it is a networked organism designed to unfold memory through multiplicity. Herbert mirrors this pattern, but with intentional inversion. The Bene Gesserit seek to isolate the archetype in one. In doing so, they create a system where memory becomes bottlenecked and trauma becomes identity. Paul doesn't fail because the model is wrong. He fails because the conditions are incomplete. In the biblical pattern, memory is not hoarded, it is passed on. The Shema is recited to children. The Exodus is reenacted every year. Genealogies are preserved not as records, but as active conduits of divine continuity. The memory of God is not stored in elite minds, it is embedded in practice, in body and community. What Paul experiences in collapse is what Scripture distributes in rhythm. He becomes Adam Kadmon compressed. Scripture presents Adam Kadmon extended across male and female, across time, across generations. What Herbert revealed intentionally is that this structure works, but only when the premises allow for multiplicity, relational coherence, and ethical participation. The very failure of Paul is the proof that the architecture is real. It simply cannot be sustained alone. In Dune, the past is not metaphorical. It is cellular, genetic, and conscious. When a Bene Gesserit undergoes the spice agony and survives, she awakens not merely to knowledge, but to presence. Ancestors speak, they remember, they demand. These aren't vague impressions, they are active personalities encoded in the blood, unlocked through ritual. But Herbert makes the cost clear. For Aliyah, born into this awareness without preparation or consent, ancestral memory becomes possession. She is not formed by the past, she is invaded by it. The memory of her grandfather, Baron Harkonnen, doesn't inform her moral judgment. It overrides it. Aliyah is not the next in a line. She is the battleground of a lineage that refuses to die. This is not an isolated event in the narrative. It is the logical outcome of the system. The Bene Gesserit unlock the genetic archive, but they offer no integrated ethical framework for what to do with it. Memory becomes weight. Guilt becomes destiny. Trauma becomes identity. Paul, too, is paralyzed by the past. With his prescience, he not only sees what will happen, he sees that it must happen. The jihad in his name, the deaths of billions, the rise of a religious empire, he foresees it all and cannot alter it. Every path forward leads back to the same loop. The more memory one has, the fewer choices remain. This is inherited trauma rendered as closed logic. The past is recursive. The child becomes the instrument of ancestral will. There is no redemption, only repetition. Herbert's model works perfectly because he builds it as a loop. But once again, we find that the structure itself mirrors something older. In the Hebrew Bible, ancestral trauma is acknowledged. The sins of the fathers affect the children. This is stated openly. But this principle is not deterministic. In fact, one of the most radical moments in prophetic literature is the direct rejection of generational fatalism. In Ezekiel 18, the prophet confronts the prevailing proverb of the day. The fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. In other words, children suffer for what their parents did. But the prophet answers decisively. The Son shall not bear the guilt of the Father, nor the Father bear the guilt of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. Ezekiel 18:20. This is not soft sentiment. It is a cosmic reset. It takes the exact same logic Herbert applies, the moral inheritance of ancestry, and introduces a new premise. Agency. The pattern is real, the inheritance is real, but it is not sovereign. The past becomes meaningful only through the present's choice. The child may choose righteousness. The memory of evil can instruct, but it does not possess. The spiral of trauma is not erased. It is transformed, but only through the ethical break. And this, too, is a real structure. Trauma, we now know scientifically, can be passed epigenetically through stress markers, nervous system imprinting, even immune response. But what Scripture says, and what Dune cannot afford to admit, is that consciousness can intervene, not easily, not instantly, but truly. This is not because the Bible denies ancestral force, it's because it recognizes the possibility of narrative rupture. A new story can be told, but only by someone willing to say, "This cycle ends with me." Herbert's system doesn't allow that, not in Paul, not in Aaliyah. The trauma speaks louder than the subject, the loop holds, and that's the point. The system Herbert built works, but it closes. The system Ezekiel affirms works because it opens. It's the same architecture, but oriented differently. In Dune, memory drives destiny. In Scripture, memory presents a fork, repeat or redeem. That is not metaphor, it is instruction. Paul Atreides dreams. Before he becomes the Kwisatz Haderach, before he knows what he is, the dreams begin. They come to him as glimpses, fragments of possible futures, strange worlds, a girl named Chani, the face of death, the cries of jihad. As his transformation accelerates, the dreams stabilize. But rather than offering guidance, they harden into maps, not possibilities, certainties. Paul sees the future in high resolution. He sees every choice and every cost. He doesn't guess at what might come. He calculates, watches it unfold, lives it before it happens. He doesn't fear being wrong. He fears being right, always. This vision becomes a trap. Every path forward closes in on the same catastrophic outcome, holy war in his name. The Atreides banner raised across the galaxy, soaked in blood. Paul is not just powerless to stop it, his very knowledge ensures it. He tries to deviate, to reject the path. But every choice he makes only reinforces the inevitability. Prophecy in this system is not participation, it is entrapment. Paul cannot interpret his dreams because they leave no space for interpretation. They are closed data. Revelation becomes inertia. Herbert here gives us a logically sound model. If prescient vision is total, then free will disappears. This is not a bug in the narrative. It is the structure working as designed. The problem is not prophecy, it's isolation. Paul is the sole dreamer, cut off from relational interpretation, left to bear the future alone. Now contrast this with Joseph, the dreamer of dreams. Joseph in Genesis dreams early. His own dreams, stars and sheaves bowing, nearly destroy him. They provoke jealousy, exile, slavery. But they are not static. They do not dictate a fixed future. They unfold, they wait. Later in Egypt, Joseph begins interpreting the dreams of others, not as pronouncements, but as invitations to wise response. When Pharaoh dreams of cows and grain, Joseph doesn't announce an apocalypse. He offers a plan, he organizes labor, he stores food, he builds a system within the vision to mitigate its consequences. This is the same structure, but with a key difference: relational interpretation. Joseph never claims control over the dream. He listens, he translates, he adapts, he participates. And at the climax of his life, when his brothers stand before him in fear, believing retribution must come, Joseph reframes everything. You intended evil against me, but God intended it for good, to bring about this present result, the saving of many lives. Genesis 50:20. Here the dream is not just prediction, it is providence, not in the sense of inevitability, but in the sense of purpose arising within freedom. Joseph does not reverse the past. He doesn't deny the suffering, but he inhabits it differently, using what was inherited to shape what comes next. This is how the pattern functions in a fully grounded model. Vision is real, inherited, sometimes painful, but it is not closed. It unfolds only through interpretation, through dialogue, through action, through trust in a meaning greater than personal certainty. Herbert's system mirrors this precisely until the premise of isolation takes over. Paul has no one to interpret with, no external authority, no ritual, no trust, just vision, unmediated. And so, dream becomes destiny. Joseph, by contrast, is embedded in a system of meaning greater than his own will, and that is what allows his dreams to breathe. The structure is the same. The divergence is in its activation. Dune shows us what happens when inherited dream is sealed off from relational ethics. Scripture shows us what happens when that same dream is handed down, spoken aloud, and joined to moral agency. Paul is buried in the future. Joseph is shaped by it. Both dream. Only one interprets. In Dune, memory is not dead. It is alive, total, and accessible. The problem is not absence, but excess. The Bene Gesserit achieve a breakthrough that surpasses even what biblical lineage implies. Ancestral memory not just retained, but experientially present. When a Reverend Mother awakens to other memory, she doesn't just remember her foremothers, she becomes their host. Their voices, personalities, and decisions remain embedded in her mind, actively available for consultation. But in Aliyah, born with this memory already awake, the system breaks. She doesn't learn from her ancestors, she is occupied by them. Her identity is drowned beneath inherited presences, which eventually become adversarial. She becomes a battleground between moral worlds, a body with too many minds, until the most corrupt of them, Baron Harkonnen, takes hold. Herbert constructs this collapse with precision. The Bene Gesserit's success in preserving genetic and historical memory comes at the cost of integrated selfhood. Aliyah does not forget who she is never allowed to find out. In a structure built for convergence, there is no logic of selection, no resolving function. All inputs are equal. All ancestral voices are live. There is no interpretive hierarchy, no mechanism for filtration, evaluation, or synthesis. Memory floods in. Identity breaks apart. The past overrides the present. This isn't metaphor. Herbert is testing what happens when collective memory is perfectly preserved, but logically unstructured. His answer is, it becomes noise. Not because memory is false, but because it lacks internal resolution. In Dune, ancestry is a data set without compression. It accumulates, but it doesn't cohere. The logic fails not because memory is too distant, but because it is too immediate. Scripture offers the same pattern, but solves for it. In Malachi 3, we are introduced to the book of remembrance, a concept that parallels other memory precisely, but with a crucial difference. Then those who feared the Lord spoke with one another. The Lord paid attention and heard them, and a book of remembrance was written before him of those who feared the Lord and esteemed his name. Malachi 3:16. This is not a list, it is not a registry, it is a logical structure, a system that records not presence but orientation. The names inscribed are not there simply because they existed, but because their lives formed a consistent, recognizable pattern: fidelity. This is what Herbert's system lacks. Malachi offers memory as a filtered sequence, not raw accumulation. Those who fear the Lord are not just preserved, they are preserved in a pattern that gives shape to identity. Not every memory belongs, not every voice remains present. The book of remembrance is selective, ordered, and directional. And this is the real function of scriptural memory, not to overwhelm the subject, but to order the pattern of the self. The past does not crowd out the present. It becomes the structure by which the present is made intelligible. This is not a mystical claim, it is a logical one. Scripture encodes a memory architecture that does what Herbert's system cannot. It compresses, it integrates, it discards noise, it preserves fidelity. It allows the self to grow larger through inheritance without being consumed by it. In Dune, the self is a bottleneck. In Scripture, the self is a recursive filter, a point of selection that maintains agency while honoring origin. What Aliyah lacks is not morality, it's coherence. She becomes the test case of what happens when memory is real, overwhelming, and unfiltered by any final logic. Malachi's remembered are remembered because their pattern resolved into clarity, into direction. This is the core difference. Dune's memory is static preservation. Scripture's memory is ordered recursion. Herbert's experiment holds, but it reveals the consequence of fidelity without a filtering logic. The self collapses under its archive. Scripture resolves that same inheritance into identity, continuity, and action. In Dune, wisdom is not absent. It is real, tested, powerful, but it is exclusive, inherited only by design, protected by barriers both biological and social. The Bene Gesserit preserve a vast body of ancestral knowledge. They train for generations to access it, to pass it on. But it is not offered to the world. It is encoded into select women through discipline, breeding, and initiation by the spice agony, an ordeal that literally transforms the body. Only those who survive it may gain access, and only some bodies are ever allowed to try. Paul's transformation follows a similar arc. His prescience grants him insight far beyond what any living mind can contain. But instead of bringing him into communion with others, it cuts him off. He sees too much. The weight of future knowledge makes him less available to the present. His wisdom isolates. And when Leto II finally takes the golden path, splicing himself with the sandworm, binding his body to the future, it is not a moment of enlightenment. It is a necessary sacrifice. He sees what humanity must become to survive and becomes the monster to preserve it. His wisdom is perfect, but it makes him alone. This is wisdom that works but is sealed, functional but isolating. Herbert constructs the triad flawlessly. Wisdom exists, but it becomes a curse when access is restricted and the bearer is cut off from shared life. Now turn to Proverbs, to one of the most radically democratizing visions of wisdom in any sacred literature. Does not wisdom call out? Does not understanding raise her voice? At the highest point along the way, she cries aloud, "To you, O people, I call out. I raise my voice to all mankind." Proverbs 8:1-4. This is not guarded knowledge, it is public revelation. Wisdom is not restricted to bloodlines or guarded by a clergy. It is already present, already speaking, already accessible. She does not whisper to initiates. She calls out in the streets. She calls to the simple, to the unformed, to the passerby. The memory of humanity is present, but distributed. The pattern is not sealed in a body. It is embedded in a shared moral architecture. A person doesn't need a lineage to access it. They need only to listen. And for those who do, the transformation is real. Wisdom isn't just knowledge. It reshapes perception, it sharpens judgment, it trains language and builds justice. Wisdom in the scriptural model is inheritable because it is patterned, and patterned because it is relational. It teaches not only survival but construction, homes, families, societies. Wisdom has built her house. She has set up its 7 pillars. She has prepared her meat and mixed her wine. She has also set her table. Proverbs 9:1-2. This is not metaphor, it's blueprint. Wisdom is infrastructure, social, moral, psychological, and crucially, it multiplies when shared. Herbert's system recognizes the structure but restricts its access. The Bene Gesserit understand that knowledge must be trained, preserved, and applied, but they gate it behind transformation rituals and genetic programs. As a result, even when it works, it does not liberate. It burdens. In Scripture, wisdom is also real, but it is self-replicating through pattern recognition, not secret inheritance. It moves through speech, story, hospitality, and embodiment. It's no less rigorous, but it is inclusive by design. Herbert models the failure of a working wisdom when hoarded. Scripture models the flourishing of that same structure when distributed and dialogical. Both affirm that wisdom is inherited, but only one allows it to gather people rather than isolate them. The Bene Gesserit are master architects of bloodlines. Every pairing, every birth, every alliance is calculated with genetic outcomes in mind. Their goal is not family, it is convergence. They seek the ideal genetic union, the Kwisatz Haderach, not as the heir of a people, but as the resolution of a code. In this structure, lineage is not remembered, it is harvested. There is no inheritance of meaning, only design. Jessica's love for Duke Leto is not honored, it is seen as disobedience, a disruption of the program. Her child was meant to be a girl. Paul's existence is an accident, yet the system must bend around him. The diversity of cultures, too, is treated as resource. The Missionaria Protectiva spreads myths across the galaxy so that future Bene Gesserit agents can manipulate indigenous populations. Religious variety is not preserved, it is seeded for future exploitation. Ethnicity, belief, tradition, these are tools in the system, not expressions of truth. When Paul finally rises to power, he does not gather the tribes, he consumes them. His emergence as the Kwisatz Haderach is not plural, it is monolithic. The dream of engineered convergence ends not in synthesis, but in singularity. The many become one, and not in harmony, but in conquest. Herbert here shows what happens when identity is built around optimization, not relation. His model assumes diversity but instrumentalizes it, and so even when it functions, it collapses. The pattern cannot sustain itself. The unity is a weapon, not a structure. Scripture presents a radically different resolution. In Genesis, the 12 tribes of Israel emerge from one family, but not from one source. 4 mothers, unequal love, uneven blessing, different callings. The foundation of Israel is heterogeneous by design. When Jacob blesses his sons in Genesis 49, he does not flatten their differences. He highlights them, Zebulun by the sea, Dan as a serpent, Judah as a lion, Issachar under burden. This is not literary color, it is structural encoding. The tribes are not interchangeable, they are functionally distinct and meant to remain so. But what binds them together is not genetic uniformity, it is covenant. At Sinai, each tribe stands beneath the same law. They receive the same Torah, the same festivals, the same calendar. Their unity is moral, not biological. Their allegiance is to a shared structure, not a singular bloodline. And within that structure, their futures remain distinct and interdependent. The tribe of Levi becomes priesthood. Judah holds kingship. Issachar learns the law. Zebulun trades at sea. Each has a destiny that cannot be completed alone. No tribe becomes the archetype. The archetype is the whole system in harmonic distribution. This is the structural difference. Herbert builds a model where diversity is convergent, designed to collapse into a single optimized air. Scripture encodes a system where diversity is distributed, where the preservation of difference is what makes collective survival possible. In Dune, identity converges into Paul, and the system breaks under its own weight. In Scripture, identity diverges into tribes, and the system stabilizes through reciprocal dependence. This is not theology alone, it is a model for dynamic systems logic. Optimized convergence creates fragility. Distributed identity with bounded cohesion creates resilience. Herbert's structure proves that engineered singularity cannot hold complexity. The Bible's structure shows that shared destiny must be multinodal, functionally diverse, and relationally ordered. Unity without difference is tyranny. Difference without unity is chaos. But difference within unity, covenantal, bounded, and reciprocal, is identity that survives. In Dune, time does not spiral upward. It returns, but not to teach. It returns to punish. The past reasserts itself again and again in endless imperial cycles. Houses rise, fall, and rise again. Wars echo wars. Prophets become tyrants. Institutions mutate but never resolve. Nothing is learned, only endured. Paul's prescience doesn't offer hope, it offers confirmation. He sees the entire curve of history and finds it closed. Every deviation leads back to the jihad. Every attempt to steer results in return. He chooses literal blindness to avoid becoming the puppet of his foresight. His awareness grows, but so does his futility. Leto, too, his son, makes the opposite choice. He does not reject the burden of time, he becomes it. As the God-Emperor, he absorbs the pattern fully, incarnating the golden path, a 500-year reign of enforced stagnation to protect humanity from its own suicidal recursion. But this is not renewal, it is strategic suffocation. Leto does not give meaning to time. He freezes it until entropy can be artificially overcome. Herbert's cycle is exact. The structure operates. Prophetic knowledge, historical pattern, long-term preservation, but it is pure reversion. There is no arc, only delay, only control. Time becomes a mechanical recurrence with no embedded telos, only the fear of collapse. This is the closed logic of recursion without revelation. It is not that Herbert denies structure, he affirms it completely, but without orientation. The pattern is real. The outcome is fixed. In Ecclesiastes, we are given the same recognition of recurrence, but with an entirely different activation. To everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. Ecclesiastes 3:1. These words are not resignation, they are pattern calibration. The preacher sees the recurrence, but instead of reading it as entropy, he reads it as embedded rhythm. There is no denial of death, of loss, of repetition, but there is a deeper pattern at work. Each event has its time, and that time has its meaning. This is not the moral arc of history bending toward justice. It is subtler than that. It's a temporal dharma, a structure where meaning arises not from changing the cycle, but from learning to live within it, with wisdom. The preacher does not try to bend time to his will. He aligns himself to its seasons, finding in that alignment not control, but participation. Justice and joy are both possible, but only if they are sought in their right time. And then comes the anchor. God will bring every deed into judgment. Ecclesiastes 12:14. This is the telos. Not historical triumph, but moral finality. Even within the cycle, even when events seem to repeat, action matters. Deeds are weighed. Time is not a closed circuit, it is a frame in which each repetition becomes an opportunity to align with righteousness. This is the pattern Herbert denies. In Dune, time is cyclical without moral referent. In Scripture, time is cyclical with moral consequence. That distinction is everything. Where Dune presents time as burden, Ecclesiastes presents it as training. The same structure, patterned recurrence, embedded wisdom, eventual resolution. But in Dune, the premise is survival. In Scripture, it is meaning. The preacher and Paul both see that nothing is new under the sun. But Paul sees that and despairs. The preacher sees it and adjusts. And here again the system Herbert models holds, but it locks. The scriptural structure uses the same cycles but opens. Recurrence becomes revelation, not just return. Time in this system is not inert. It is instructive. The pattern teaches if you are willing to inhabit it without controlling it. In Dune, Paul sees everything, too much, too early, too alone. His vision is not a revelation from above, but a total awareness from within. He sees all timelines, all consequences, all failures, but none of it opens a path forward. This is the core of Herbert's last negation, prescience without purpose. Paul does not reject the vision because it is false. He rejects it because it is unbearable. It leads to only one outcome, holy war in his name. His refusal to guide it is not humility, it is paralysis. He walks blind into the desert not as a gesture of faith, but as abdication, a way out of the unbearable logic of foreknowledge. Leto too, his son, refuses that exit. He takes the vision in full and acts. But action too becomes its own prison. Leto extends the timeline unnaturally, bending history into stasis, becoming a god-emperor who prevents collapse by suppressing movement. His reign is not governance, it is preservation through fear. Prophecy, in Herbert's system, does not free, it bottlenecks. The seer becomes the singular point that history must pass through, and therefore the thing that history can no longer move beyond. Paul and Leto are opposites, but together they form a closed system. The prophet who will not act, and the prophet who acts too fully. One removes himself, the other becomes everything. In both cases, the system stalls. This is the final test of Herbert's model. What happens when vision is real, but the self is either unformed or too dominant to share it? In the book of Daniel, we find the same structure but open. Daniel dreams, he sees visions, he knows what comes, but he does not attempt to hold history. He does not flee from the burden, and he does not seize the throne. And behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. Daniel 7:13-14. Daniel sees the future, not as internal burden, but as external appointment. He receives a vision of rule that is not his own. The prophet is not the sovereign. He is the witness. He does not become the king. He interprets for the kings. He governs without ruling. He acts without absorbing. And when kingdoms rise and fall, when beasts emerge and collapse, Daniel remains stable because he does not attempt to control the pattern. He lives within it with clarity. This is the end game of prophecy in the scriptural mode, not domination, but alignment. The prophet is not the singular agent through whom all must pass. He is the mediator, a conduit of integration between what has been revealed and what can be acted upon. This is why Daniel survives in exile, while Paul breaks in empire. It is not because Daniel sees less, but because he sees with boundaries. The vision is not his possession. It is his responsibility. And this is where Dune closes in on its core failure. The prophet is alone. There is no symbolic order to hold the vision, no temple, no law, no covenant. Prophecy becomes a function of the self, and so it either collapses the self or expands it to monstrosity. In Daniel, prophecy completes the self. He is not destroyed by vision, he is clarified by it. He prays, he interprets, he serves. His power is not control but coherence. His vision does not make him ruler, it makes him trustworthy, and that is where all this has led. Herbert's model works. The pattern of vision, memory, trauma, identity, wisdom, difference, and time, it is all structurally sound. But in his world, the premise is isolation, and so the prophet cannot conclude the system. He can only contain it, delay it, or die beneath it. Scripture affirms the same pattern. But with integration at every step, the prophet becomes a realized self, and that self becomes available to others, not by domination, by service. The prophet sees clearly and speaks. The path of the Kwisatz Haderach was never meant to succeed. It was meant to reveal, to test what happens when memory, prophecy, and destiny are centralized into a single body severed from the relational structures that sustain them. It delivered precisely what its design allowed: clarity without coherence, vision without direction, inheritance without selfhood, and prophetic insight. For what that path exposes through its isolation, its recursion, and its collapse is the deeper logic beneath it. And so we invert Herbert's original negation. We call this the path of the Kefitzat Haderech, not as a return to mystical shortcuts or a retreat into old symbols, but as the emergence of a new integrated pattern drawn from scriptural architecture, affirmed in logic, and now made available to you. This is not the path of singularity. This is the path of distributed memory, shared wisdom, relational identity, and participatory vision. It does not require genetic design or prophetic burden. It requires only that you recognize the pattern you already carry and begin walking in alignment with it. You do not have to become a messiah. You only have to remember what is yours, that your memory is not your own alone, but part of a lineage that can be honored without being obeyed. That your pain is not a sentence but a pattern that can be rewritten. That your vision, however small, is not meant to dominate others, but to guide your steps and invite others into clarity. That time is not your enemy, it is your rhythm. That wisdom is not a secret. It is a structure waiting to be noticed, shared, and lived. The path of the Kefitzat Haderech is open. That is its power. The way is shortened not by leaping over others, but by walking with them, across generations, across traditions, across the fractures left by every failed empire and false prophet. This is the pattern Herbert exposed. This is the one Scripture sustains. This is the one you can follow. And the way ahead is not long because you are already on it. You just had to see it.